By the summer of 1941, Germany had already conquered most of Europe. Its army was the most powerful fighting force on the planet. Its generals were experienced, disciplined, and highly skilled. And yet, within 4 years, that same army would be completely destroyed. The question is not whether Germany lost. The question is why. Because the answer is not what most people think. Germany did not lose because it was outgunned. It lost because one man stopped listening to the people who understood war. Adolf Hitler was not a trained military strategist. He was a political leader who had risen through ideology, charisma, and instinct. In the early years of the war, that instinct seemed to work. Quick victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans gave Hitler enormous confidence. His generals had sometimes been cautious. Hitler had pushed forward anyway, and he had been proven right, repeatedly. That pattern was dangerous, not because the victories were false, but because they taught Hitler the wrong lesson. He began to believe that his judgment was superior to that of his professional military commanders. He began to see caution as weakness. He began to see disagreement as disloyalty. This is the moment the war began to change. Not on a battlefield, in a mindset. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory, along a front that stretched nearly 2,000 kilometers. The initial results were stunning. Soviet forces were overwhelmed. Entire armies were encircled and captured. Within weeks, Germany had advanced further and faster than almost anyone had predicted. Hitler was convinced this was further proof of his strategic genius. But his generals were watching something else. They were watching the distances grow longer, the supply lines stretch thinner. The Soviet Union was not collapsing the way France had. It was retreating, reorganizing, and absorbing punishment in ways no Western country could. General Franz Halder, the chief of the German Army General Staff, noted in his war diary that the Soviets were not behaving like a defeated enemy. They were behaving like a country that intended to keep fighting indefinitely. Then came one of the most consequential decisions of the entire war. In August 1941, the German army was approaching a critical fork in its strategy. Army Group Center had been pushing toward Moscow with considerable momentum. Moscow was the Soviet capital, a major rail hub, and a powerful symbol. Most of Hitler's senior commanders, including Halder and Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, believed that capturing Moscow should be the primary objective. Taking the capital, they argued, would cripple Soviet logistics, threaten the political heart of the enemy, and potentially force a decisive confrontation. It was, in their professional assessment, the correct move. Hitler disagreed. He ordered Army Group Center to halt its advance on Moscow. Instead, he redirected significant armored forces south toward Ukraine and north toward Leningrad. His reasoning was partly economic. Ukraine held vast agricultural land and industrial resources. The Caucasus region held oil. Hitler believed that capturing these resources was more important than capturing a city. He told his generals they did not understand the economic realities of war. He dismissed their objections. He signed the order himself. Halder later described that decision as one of the greatest strategic mistakes of the entire campaign. The southern operation, which became the Battle of Kyiv, was technically a massive success. Nearly 600,000 Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured. On paper, it looked like a triumph. Hitler called it the greatest battle in history. His confidence reached a new peak, but those weeks spent redirecting forces south meant the advance on Moscow had been delayed by nearly 2 months. 2 months does not sound like much. In the Soviet Union, in 1941, it was everything. By the time German forces resumed their push toward Moscow in October, under Operation Typhoon, autumn was already turning. The roads, which had never been designed for the volume of German military traffic, were dissolving into mud. The Germans called it the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Tanks became stuck. Supply trucks could not move. the entire momentum of the advance slowed to almost nothing, and then, in November, the temperature dropped dramatically. German soldiers were not equipped for a Soviet winter. They had been told the campaign would be over before cold weather arrived. Hitler had planned for a quick victory. His generals had asked for winter equipment. Those requests had been largely ignored. The soldiers at the front were fighting in summer uniforms in temperatures that fell below -30 degrees. Weapons stopped functioning. Engine oil froze. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite. The Wehrmacht, the most professional army in the world, was being defeated not by Soviet bullets alone, but by a calendar. And that calendar had been shortened by Hitler's decision to delay the Moscow offensive by 2 months. Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive outside Moscow in December 1941. For the first time in the war, German forces were pushed back. The myth of German invincibility cracked. The Blitzkrieg, which had defined Germany's war up to that point, had stalled. Hitler's response to this setback revealed something important about how he operated under pressure. Rather than reassessing his strategic assumptions, he looked for someone to blame. He dismissed dozens of senior commanders. Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, the commander of the army, was removed. Halder was eventually dismissed the following year. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most talented armoured commanders, was relieved of command after asking permission to conduct a tactical retreat that might have saved his forces. Hitler refused the retreat. Guderian insisted. Hitler removed him. This pattern repeated itself throughout the war. Any general who disagreed with Hitler, who presented uncomfortable facts, who recommended retreat or consolidation, risked being dismissed, humiliated, or worse. The result was predictable. Over time, the generals who remained around Hitler were increasingly those who told him what he wanted to hear. The honest assessments became rarer. The professional military advice that might have corrected course was quietly suppressed. The Wehrmacht was gradually transformed from a military organization into a system designed to execute Hitler's personal will, regardless of whether that will made military sense. In 1942, this dynamic produced another catastrophic decision. Hitler ordered a massive offensive in the south of the Soviet Union, targeting the Caucasus oil fields and the city of Stalingrad simultaneously. His generals cautioned that trying to achieve both objectives at once would stretch German forces too thin. Hitler overruled them. He divided his forces and pushed toward both targets. When Soviet resistance stiffened at Stalingrad, what began as a secondary objective became an obsession. Stalingrad carried Stalin's name. For Hitler, that made its capture a matter of prestige rather than strategy. He poured resources into the city at the expense of everything else. When Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus in November 1942 and encircled the entire German Sixth Army, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus requested permission to break out while it was still possible. Hitler refused. He ordered the Sixth Army to stand fast. He told them they would be supplied by air. That promise was impossible to keep. The Luftwaffe could not deliver even a fraction of what was needed. Over 300,000 German soldiers were trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket. By February 1943, after months of brutal fighting, starvation, and cold, the Sixth Army surrendered. Nearly 90,000 men walked into Soviet captivity. Very few of them would ever return home. Stalingrad broke something irreparable in the German war effort. The losses in manpower, equipment, and morale could not be replaced at the scale the Eastern Front demanded. From that point forward, Germany was strategically on the defensive. The question was no longer whether Germany would win. The question was how long it could hold on. What makes this history worth examining carefully is not the drama of the battles themselves. It is the internal logic that drove these failures. Hitler was not an unintelligent man. He understood propaganda, political maneuvering, and the psychology of mass movements with extraordinary skill, but he carried a deep and unexamined belief that willpower could substitute for planning. That conviction, held with certainty, made him resistant to information that contradicted it. When reality did not match his expectations, he did not update his expectations. He rejected the reality. His generals operated with a different framework. They were trained to assess situations objectively, to account for logistics, weather, supply, and enemy capability. They understood that war was not won through determination alone. They tried, repeatedly, to communicate this. They were ignored, dismissed, and eventually silenced. The gap between what Hitler believed and what the situation actually required grew wider with every passing year, and Germany's military capacity shrank in direct proportion to that gap. There is a broader principle embedded in this history. Organizations fail not only when they make bad decisions, but when they build structures that prevent good decisions from reaching the top. Hitler created exactly that structure. He surrounded himself with men who feared disagreement. He treated military expertise as less valuable than personal loyalty. He mistook early success for permanent competence. And he confused the certainty he felt inside his own mind with an accurate picture of the world outside it. The German military in 1939 was genuinely formidable. Its doctrine, training, and leadership were among the best in the world. But by 1943, much of that institutional quality had been hollowed out, not by enemy action alone, by decisions made at the top that prioritized ego over expertise and loyalty over truth. Germany lost World War II for many reasons: Allied industrial capacity, Soviet resilience, American resources, British persistence. These are all real factors. But underneath all of them is a simpler truth. Germany entered the war with a military system capable of extraordinary things. Then, decision by decision, that system was dismantled from within. The men who understood war were replaced by men who understood obedience. And in that replacement, the outcome of the war was quietly decided. Not in the ruins of Stalingrad, not in the fields of Normandy, but in the meeting rooms where honest advice was given and then ignored.